Over the last 4 years of studying art history and going to art museums, I've had a lot of questions. But I think the biggest ones were about diversity. What was the rest of the world doing while Europeans were having all these artistic movements? Where are the people of color in these museums? What happens when different cultures met? This week, I'd like to try to start answering those questions. My name is Megan Reynolds, and I'm bringing you Behind the Easel. Today's episode is about Indigenous art, which is something I really want to talk about, but I don't have much insight on. So I talked with Dr. Christa Irwin, an art history professor from Marywood University. The focus of her grad studies and her thesis was Latin American art, so I knew she'd be the perfect person to talk to. Dr. Irwin defined Indigenous art as anything that is original to its place. She went on to explain some of the issues with that term.
It's a big question, because I think one of the things that comes up a lot in people that study Indigenous art is that that's a single term that defines an incredibly diverse array of cultures and art. So it's sort of problematic in a way. I mean, there's not necessarily a better term except to be specific. But even when I'm thinking about Indigenous art in Latin America, which is what my focus of research often is, even if you get more specific by culture and you talk about Aztec art, that too is such a massive category with so much diversity that I think it doesn't totally do it justice. Or in South America, a lot of people refer to Andean art, like art produced by cultures that grew up along the Andes. But that is, we're talking about centuries of production from cultures that were sometimes related and sometimes not very related at all. So I think in that word, to me, it makes me think of just how much material there is, some of which I know about, some of which I don't. So it's I'm curious about it, but aware of how much there is to study.
It was at this point in my interview that I realized I may have bitten off a little bit more than I could chew. But I never intended to cover all of Indigenous art in just one podcast episode. This will merely act as an introduction. I decided to focus more on how we study Indigenous art and how we display it, rather than what it is, where it comes from, and the original cultures. Not that those things aren't important, just that there's so much ground to cover I had to pick a starting point. I asked Dr. Irwin how Indigenous art is usually taught.
Again, we teach these art history 1 and 2 classes. There's just no possible way to cover everything. Yeah. It's just impossible.
That way.
And so I've kind of been well, I'm just not going to cover everything. I might not show you Michelangelo's David, but you know what? You've probably seen it before. And so but then some people are going further and saying well, maybe the better way to do it is make it a theme. Make it about decorative arts in the global world. And it's not so much about trying to show you everything from every culture in any kind of chronological way, but at least just studying visual culture. Yeah. But I think the question becomes are you losing something in not setting up the chronology then?
Obviously, finding the perfect way to teach art history is nearly impossible. We both agreed that non-Western art is largely ignored.
But it also, I think it deserves more attention. Even the way that I or most people teach art history survey, it gets 2 days Indigenous art in South America, if you're lucky. But it's its own survey of thousands of years in itself. So I think it's misunderstood, but fascinating. I'm super interested in it.
But again, teaching this area of art is difficult because a majority of the pieces from that time and place were destroyed by colonizers, and no records were kept as to what was there before Europeans arrived.
A lot of it was destroyed intentionally. Particularly things that were destroyed were things that represented the religion of the local population that might draw attention away from Christianity. In particular, the Christians were really upset about the fact that the Inca believed that the deities could embody objects So like could embody a gold statue. And so the statue would actually be worshipped because it was embodying the deity. But to Christians, that was idolatry. It was worshiping an object. And so those objects needed to be destroyed. In Peru in particular, there's this whole campaign where they actually are systematically destroying anything that might reek of idolatry in their definition of it. So there's lots of intentional destruction of things, which is sad.
Obviously, not everything got destroyed.
Well, some things were preserved, but a lot of things were destroyed. And there are scholars, there are art historians who study pre-Columbian art, as they call it, before Columbus shows up. And so there's definitely lots of scholarship on that. It's not as accessible probably because you're just not as familiar with it. But yeah, there are scholars that specialize in Mayan art or Aztec or Inca or Nazca or Moche, all of these cultures that existed prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So it is there, but I think it's not something you see front and center in a museum. And it's not something that shows up in your classes.
Though people are stubborn, so Europeans couldn't really erase indigenous cultures. The natives stuck to some traditions.
Is the indigenous art does persist to a certain degree because you can't just make people stop believing what they believe in. You can baptize them and officially tell them to go to church and conversion does happen. Latin America is a Catholic place now, but it doesn't just go away. And so there's still objects that are in use despite the fact that the Spanish are there. But also, the Christian missionaries were kind of crafty in that they didn't want to completely destroy any remnants of the past, because if you communicate Christianity through the vocabulary of indigenous art, maybe it's more relatable and more acceptable to the population. So you get a residue or sometimes a really prominent remainder of traditions of indigenous cultures that persist in the colonial period.
Of course, there's a significant amount of those two cultures mixing and becoming something entirely new. But it's still difficult to discuss.
So when I teach history of Latin American art, it's really hard to study pre-Columbian art, which is so brilliant and interesting and just amazing. And then to talk about it being destroyed or replaced. But again, in a way, it's part of history. It happens over and over and over again. It doesn't make it acceptable. But I think just we have to acknowledge it. I don't think you want to be refuse to be interested in it because of the bad connotation of it, because then you're just ignoring something else.
Exactly.
But you want to I think acknowledge the difficulty around it.
While the destruction of culture in Latin America may have ceased for now, it's still happening in other parts of the world.
ISIS is destroying things in Afghanistan that are culturally or religiously not the same as their ideas. So there's a long history to it. The Christians destroyed tons of stuff from ancient Greece because it was inappropriate.
Sadly, we can't bring back those pieces that have been destroyed. But what I can do is examine the way the remaining pieces are displayed and consider if there's anything I can do to improve the representation.
For a very long time, indigenous art was put not in art museums, but in ethnographic museums.
An ethnographic museum explores a specific culture in depth.
More commonly because it documented a culture but wasn't recognized as a work of fine art.
Well, yes, it is reasonable to put certain pieces in an ethnographic museum because they do tell us a lot about the culture. There's a big issue with not considering those pieces fine art. I discussed the problems with the term art and fine art in my last episode, and this discussion deepens the issue and brings its own set of problems. Of course, pieces from the peoples native to the Americas have been brought into various museums' collections. Now there's another issue.
I guess the challenge I have with it now is that it's the European art is really carefully displayed according to chronology. Renaissance painting, and then Baroque, and then you have modern contemporary, you have 18th and 19th century, all in separate galleries. So you're thinking about time periods. And then there's one gallery for all of the Americas for all of time. So it's still like, I think it's simplified. Then the thing I've been interested in is like segregating it means that you don't have the opportunity to look at like Spanish Renaissance painting next to an Aztec thing. I mean, some museums are like doing away with chronology and geographic divisions altogether. Like if you go to the Everhart, the new curator has made that big upper gallery just like organized according to things that look interesting together. So there's like a Buddha next to a painting from the 19th century. So it's totally mixed. So you're not driven by those divisions, but you're just looking at objects.
While I do love going into a gallery and seeing a lot of the same movement all placed together, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of different things were happening all over the world at the same time. And it's impossible to show people everything, but I think modern technology has given us a solution that we haven't taken advantage of. Most, if not every museum has a website, right? Using their own websites and databases, museums could be offering the public a plethora of information on every piece in their collection. Of course, a lot of museums do have extensive research on their websites, but I think they could utilize it better within the museum walls. The labels on the walls can only include so much information, but the inclusion of a simple QR code on each label could lead the viewer to as much information as one could possibly want on a specific piece, artist, or movement. I think it could be extremely useful in terms of how pieces are displayed. I think this would allow for more freedom in the placement of objects. If one wanted to see more of an artist or movement, they could easily find it on the website using keywords, and then find the rooms in the museum that house those pieces. Overall, I think by this point we have no reason to not be displaying more Indigenous art where it belongs, in art museums. Behind the Easel is written, researched, and produced by me, Megan Reynolds, with music by Density and Time and Doug Maxwell. Thank you for listening.